and welcome to episode 2 of Berea Apologia. It's been quite a long time since I uploaded episode 1, really much longer than I would have liked. Unfortunately, editing is taking a lot longer than I anticipated. I've also had a lot going on in my life, including having to spend 3 weeks in a hotel due to a burst water heater in my house. I am hopeful as the fall goes along that I'll be able to increase the tempo of episode releases. This episode is an introduction to the Synoptic Gospels. But before we get into that, let's consider something. So if I'm going to be talking about the Bible, it behooves me to understand if the Bible is reliable. So I decided to check in with a noted literary scholar and historian, David Cross.
When the Bible was written, and then rewritten, and then edited, and then re-edited, and then translated from dead languages, and then retranslated, and then re-edited, and then re-edited, and then retranslated, and then given to kings for them to take their favorite parts out, and then re-edited, and then retranslated, and then re-edited, and then given to the Pope for him to approve, and then retranslated, then rewritten, then rewritten, re-edited, retranslated, re-edited again, all based on stories that were told orally 30 to 90 years after they happened to people who didn't know how to write. I guess what I'm saying is the Bible is literally the world's oldest game of telephone.
So as we listen to this, you can pick up 3 objections that Mr. Cross has for the reliability of the Bible. First, he claims there are probably copyist errors. He goes written and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. He believes there are translation errors. Points out they were translated from dead languages, edited by kings and popes. And finally, that relied on oral tradition. So let's look at these 3 objections one at a time. First, I'll be honest. Copyist errors are inevitable. Before the printing press, all documents were copied by hand. Now, scribes took many precautions to try to ensure accurate copies. If you ever look at the Masoretic text, the Masoretic tradition, you will see there were thousands of rules these scribes had to follow. But despite this, errors still occurred. Even with modern books that are printed, I've found obvious typos that were missed by all the proofreading that goes into modern publishing. Stuff as simple as vor, V-O-R, instead of for, F-O-R. So how can we know that the copies we have are faithful to the autographs? And now autographs are just the technical term for the original works. This is where textual criticism comes in. In textual criticism, a scholar will compare copies and attempt to discern what the original text was. As part of this, there is the bibliographic test, which determines how accurately we can reconstruct the autographs from the copies. Now there are 2 steps to this test. Number 1, the number of ancient manuscripts, and number 2, the amount of time between the autographs and the manuscripts. So let's look at 3 well-known ancient authors' writings that we generally do not question. That would be Plato, Aristotle, and Julius Caesar. Here we find that there are about 7 ancient copies of Plato's writings, 49 copies of Aristotle's writings, and 10 copies of Caesar's writings. So if we look at Plato, the oldest copy is about 1,200 years after he wrote. For Aristotle, it's 1,400 years, and Caesar, the baby of the group, is only 1,000 years. Now, as I was looking this up, I also found that the Iliad, which is the story of the Trojan War, seems to be the most well-documented ancient writing, but still at that, there are not more than 2,000 copies, and the oldest is approximately 400 years after the original writing, which occurred 400 years after the Trojan War, so that would be a total of 800 years between the actual event and the earliest manuscripts. So let's compare it to the Bible. For the Old Testament, really couldn't find a solid number for it, but there are at a minimum 10 to 15,000 ancient copies of the Old Testament. The Ketef Hinnom find from the late 7th or early 6th century BC is the oldest manuscripts we've found. These were written between 400 to 800 years after the autographs that they reference. So the timing here is pretty much on par with the Iliad, but the number of manuscripts is significantly greater. But wait, when we get to the New Testament, the numbers are even more significant. The current estimate of New Testament manuscripts is just shy of 24,000. 5,800 are in Greek and 18,000 are in other ancient languages. That'd be Aramaic, Latin, etc. The oldest fragment we have is the John Ryland papyrus, which dates from about AD 130. So not much more than 100 years after the resurrection, and only about 75 to 80 years after the earliest dates that we believe the first parts of the New Testament were written. So what does this mean in terms of reliability of these copies to the autographs? Well, look at the numbers. The New Testament is ridiculous ridiculously well attested by manuscript data compared to other ancient writings. Now, throw in the early church fathers quoting the New Testament writings, and our accuracy numbers can only go up. Because again, many of these early church fathers were writing within the first 100 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Now, the Old Testament is at least as reliable as the most reliable of the other ancient writings, but consider this. I already mentioned the Masoretic tradition, which was the tradition under which the Old Testament was copied. So you've got these specially trained and organized scribes under a governmental and religious system doing their dead level best, like I said, 4,000 rules worth to make accurate copies. The estimate I found is that the accuracy of the New Testament to its autographs is probably greater than 99%. And most of the errors found are minor punctuation, spelling errors like favor, F-A-V-O-R versus F-A-V-O-U-R. That doesn't change anything. If we look at the English versus American spelling, those are the types of errors found in the New Testament. There is nothing there that changes any significant theological point. Now, if you want to emulate Mr. Cross and claim the Bible is unreliable due to the copying that occurred, fine. You need to throw out every other ancient writing as well. But we don't order our lives around these other ancient texts, you might say. Don't be so sure. Let's just consider Plato's writing, The Republic. Per the Philosopher's Magazine, The Republic was ranked as the greatest philosophical text in history. Open Syllabus did a study and found that The Republic is the most studied work of writing amongst the top U.S. News and World Report U.S. colleges. So it seems between these two studies that the thought leaders in our culture, and particularly in the United States, heavily studied The Republic, and it's probably heavily influenced them. Whether they are influenced towards the purpose of Plato or against, we're still ordering our life, our nation, around this work. So let's move on to translation errors. Now, these are certainly possible. Translating between languages can be very difficult, especially since cultural references, idioms, and things like that don't translate very well. Just to give you a simple example of how difficult it can be to translate the Bible, did you know there are 7 different Greek words that are translated love in English? I can list them for you. You've got eros, which is like a romantic, passionate, sexual love. You've got philia, which is more of an intimate, authentic friendship. You got ludos, which is a playful and flirtatious love. Storge, which is a familial love, say a mother for her child. Phlogia, which is a compassionate self-love. Pragma, which is a committed, companionate love. And agape, which is an empathetic, universal love. This is usually a love that we talk about when we describe God's love for his creation. So how, as a translator, do you capture these differences in these 7 meanings using the same word? Let's look at John 21, verse 15. Quote, "Now when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Tend my lambs.'" Unquote. So when Jesus asked Simon Peter if he loved him, he used the Greek word agape for the empathetic, universal, sacrificial love. When Peter answered, he answered with philia, again, the intimate friendship sort of love. So in English, we cannot pick up the nuance that the Greek puts in here. The New American Standard, which is what I read from, tries to be as close to word for word as possible. So since the Greek used one verb each time, in this case agapio and phileo, the New American Standard uses one verb as well. As I looked, all of the most popular English translations do this. Even the Message, which is a more of a paraphrase, and I would expect the author to expand more on the differences in the word love here. So yes, it does seem possible that translations would have changed the Bible. However, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic are not dead languages, as Mr. Cross said. There are actually modern versions of all 3 of these languages still spoken vernacularly. Of course, Greek in Greece, Hebrew in Israel, and Aramaic in parts of Syria. Even the ancient versions have had an unbroken history of being used in religious settings for centuries. So as I mentioned above, with the copies, we can look at these and see how well the translations kept to the autographs that we've recreated looking at those copies. And knowing the languages are still spoken, there are still experts we can look to ensure the translations were faithful to the original language. So what about edits made by leaders? After all, we know that some early Christians, especially following the Edict of Milan in AD 313, were very careful not to offend the emperor. For example, several 4th century canons issued by church leaders omitted the book of Revelation as scripture. Now, they did leave it as an edifying work, but they would not include it in their canon. And this was because of its apparent prediction of the destruction of Rome. However, many of the ancient copies of the New Testament existed before the concept of a pope over the entire church ever existed. See, before at least AD 500, major decisions in the church were made at ecumenical councils. We see these like the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, or the famous Council of Nicaea in AD 325. If you've read the Da Vinci Code, you probably believe you're familiar with. See, it was really after the fall of the Western Empire that the Bishop of Rome took the mantle of leadership of the Christian world. And really, he was only recognized as leader over the western part of the Christian world. The eastern part was still under the Roman Empire in Byzantium for another 1,000 years, and so they had no need for a pope as the Western Christian world did. Many of these manuscripts also existed before any kings who would have cared what the Bible said came to power. Again, this is before the Edict of Milan. Christianity was, at best, just an annoying sect of Judaism, and at worst, an atheistic plot against Rome, which needed to be wiped out. So these kings, these emperors, the proconsuls, the other leaders, they wouldn't have cared what our scripture said, because there was no way these mere mortals, these atheists, could compete against the gods of the Roman pantheon. So therefore, look at the more ancient copies, and comparing those to later copies, we can see whether or not edits were made at the behest of kings or popes. And the truth is, we don't see them. So finally, what about the fact that the Bible grew from oral traditions? So firstly, let me just point out, the 30 to 90-year-old tradition that David mentions is not a great time span as far as oral traditions go. Let's compare it to today. 30 years ago was 1992. Happened to be my freshman year in high school. And it was also, if you'll recall, a presidential election year. I still remember the big slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." I remember watching Dan Quayle, and Al Gore debate. I remember watching it in class and a couple of the girls saying, I really wish I could vote for George Bush and Al Gore. I remember Ross Perot was in the race, out of the race, back in the race. I mean, it had something to do with black helicopters. I didn't really understand it at the time and didn't go back and look now. I remember sitting shotgun in my mom's van while we were driving to school, listening to WSB News Radio out of Atlanta, and I observed that I hadn't heard any news about how bad the economy was, about the recession, since Election Day. Now keep in mind, I don't have a trained memory. I couldn't vote in 1992. What skin did I have in the game as a teenager who was president? I wasn't paying that close attention. Well, about 90 years. Well, 90 years ago was 1932, another election year. Now, today it'd be very difficult to find anyone who could remember 1932, but many of us knew people who lived through that year. I still remember sitting in my maternal grandmother's living room, talking with her as she recounted discussions from around her own family's dinner table about Roosevelt and Hoover in the election. And she was 16 at the time, so not too far off from my age in 92. So at the absolute worst, events from 1932 only need to pass through one oral account to get to today. Second, consider that there is very little similarity between the game of telephone and true historic oral traditions. So just in case you don't know, in the game of telephone, you have a group of people lined up. The first person in line tells the second one something, and now he can only say it once, he has to whisper it. The second person repeats it to the third, again, he can only say it once, and he's whispering, and so forth. So now by the time the message finally reaches the end of the line, chances are it's going to be completely different than the first message at the beginning. However, in historic oral traditions, there are several differences from that. For one, the stories are repeated over and over and over. It's not just a one-time whisper to give you the message. It's a loud voice repeating the story so that the details are remembered not just by the audience, but by any apprentices he might have who will carry on those stories after he's gone. Also, these storytellers would train their memory. Now, if you're wondering about trained memories, think about this. You probably, like me, don't have a trained memory. But if you grew up in the 1980s, the speed dial was very rare. In fact, I remember we didn't even have touch-tone dialing in the 80s. We had what was called pulse dialing, which was the old dial system. Now, our phone had the buttons on it, but when you hit the buttons, it wouldn't make a tone. It'd make kind of a noise like the dial spinning around. So because I didn't have speed dial, I had to dial every number individually. And so I had a couple of dozen phone numbers memorized. I mean, just for example, I had my parents' number, my dad's office number, the neighborhood swimming pool, both sets of grandparents, and several friends. Today, I'm lucky if I remember my own phone number. I mean, literally last night, my wife asked me what my daughter's phone number was because I was the one who set up her account and chose her phone number. And I had to look it up. I mean, I called my daughter on a fairly